Imagine for a second that you're sitting in your living room, you've locked the doors, bolted the windows, set the alarm.
Right.
You are absolutely terrified of like a masked burglar breaking in by force.
Yeah.
And you're so focused on guarding those windows, you don't even blink when a guy in a tailored suit knocks on the front door, promises to cut your heating bill in half, and just politely asks for the keys to the house.
Oh, yeah.
And you just hand him over.
And the really terrifying part of that scenario is that as you're handing him the keys, you genuinely believe you are protecting the house.
Right.
You think you're making this shrewd deal, completely blind to the fact that you've just surrendered the entire structure.
Yeah. Well, welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm your host, and today we're doing a deep dive into a crisis in perception that, well, it feels historical, but is driven by mechanisms that never really go away.
Yeah, they don't.
Our mission today is to explore a terrifying structural question. How can a democracy lose its freedom from within, while many of its own citizens still fiercely believe they are defending it?
It is arguably one of the most complex systemic paradoxes we can study.
Definitely.
And to unpack it, we are going to use a very specific, fascinating lens. We're looking at Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here, alongside the historical context provided by Michael Meyer's introduction and Gary Scharnhorst's afterword.
I love that we are using a novel as a systemic lens for this. Because when most of us think about the end of a democracy or the rise of a dictatorship, our minds immediately go to Hollywood blockbusters. We have this culturally ingrained script.
We do. The popular imagination has a very specific, almost comforting narrative for how authoritarianism arrives. It is almost always pictured as a foreign force.
Like an invasion.
Exactly. A sudden, violent military coup, tanks rolling down the street at midnight, or some sort of alien invasion. We perceive it as external, sudden, and just undeniably hostile.
Which goes back to the burglar analogy.
Yes.
We are constantly guarding against the violent breach, so we miss the structural handover. We just don't know how to recognize a threat that doesn't look like an invading army.
And that is the core of what Sinclair Lewis was trying to expose. He subverted that exact cultural trope. Lewis imagines authoritarianism emerging not from the barrel of a foreign gun, but through the ballot box.
Wow.
It comes wrapped in democratic elections, it's draped in patriotic language, and it utilizes entirely familiar institutions.
Yeah.
It arrives making popular promises to solve real economic anxieties, and it relies on ordinary organizations like civic clubs, local police, respectable businesses, simply accepting a new set of rules.
To really understand how Lewis saw this mechanism, we need to ground ourselves in the 1930s. I want to state up front that Lewis's central thesis in this book was a satirical warning.
Right.
It wasn't a literal prediction. He wasn't saying this exact thing will happen on this exact date. He was trying to say Americans are not inherently immune to fascism.
Right.
But I struggle to understand the mindset of the voters in this era. How do you go from the Roaring '20s to a public that is actually hungry for an autocrat? What is the mechanical shift there?
Well, you have to look at the economic whiplash.
Okay.
The shift from the 1920s to the 1930s wasn't just a downturn, it was a catastrophic psychological shock.
Yeah.
In the 20s, the soundtrack of America was literally the song Ain't We Got Fun.
Right.
The middle class felt snug, confident, insulated. Lewis had actually spent that entire decade satirizing their complacency in books like Main Street and Babbitt. But then the stock market crash of 1929 happens, and the entire floor falls out from under the country.
So the soundtrack changes to, brother, can you spare a dime?
Exactly. The economic security that defined the middle class vanished almost overnight. You had solid, respectable breadwinners, people who had played by all the rules, suddenly standing in soup lines.
Yeah.
Normalcy, which was the great political buzzword of the 20s under Harding, was replaced by what they called the jitters. If you read Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1933 inaugural address, he paints this grim, apocalyptic picture. Values shrunken to fantastic levels, taxes up, trade frozen, the savings of many years in thousands of families gone.
I try to put myself in the shoes of someone living through that.
Yeah.
I mean, you hear about a market crash and you think, okay, tighten the belt. But imagine your life savings, the money in your local bank, just vaporizing because the bank failed.
Yeah.
You can't feed your kids. The sheer desperation of that would fundamentally rewire how you view the government, Principles just go out the window when survival is on the line.
And when people are desperate, they demand immediate, sweeping solutions. They lose patience with the slow, deliberate, messy process of parliamentary democracy.
Yeah, they want action.
They want someone to pull a lever and fix it. And that demand creates a market for demagogues. Lewis was watching real-life figures capitalize on this exact desperation.
Let's talk about those real-life figures because they are the blueprints for this novel. You've got Huey Long in Louisiana, the kingfish.
Yeah, Huey Long is a fascinating case study in populist mechanics. He ran a movement called Share Our Wealth. His slogan was, "Every man a king."
Right.
He was promising massive homestead allowances, free education, cheap food, and guaranteed minimum incomes.
I look at those promises and I just have to ask, how on earth was he planning to pay for all of that? Did he actually have a viable economic model?
He didn't. The math didn't work at all.
I didn't think so.
No, economists at the time pointed out that even if you confiscated all the wealth from every millionaire in America, it wouldn't fund his promises for more than a few months.
Wow.
But the brilliance of Long's appeal was that the math didn't matter. He was selling retribution and dignity. He told the poor that they were poor because the rich had stolen their money and he was going to take it back.
Right.
When a system is failing, anger is a much stronger political currency than a balanced spreadsheet.
And it wasn't just politicians either. You also had Father Charles Coughlin, a populist radio priest. My notes say he was reaching an estimated 30 million listeners every week. I have to pause on that. In the 1930s, 30 million people tuning into a weekly radio sermon.
It's massive.
How did a priest become a political juggernaut?
Well, Coughlin mastered a new technology. Radio in the 1930s was an incredibly intimate medium. You didn't just read about Coughlin in a detached newspaper article. His voice was literally inside your living room.
Yeah, right there with you.
He started out supporting FDR in the New Deal, using this potent mix of Catholic social justice and economic populism. He railed against greedy bankers and the gold standard.
He pivoted, right? I mean, the messaging got much darker.
It did. When FDR didn't adopt Coughlin's radical monetary policies, Coughlin turned on him. And the rhetoric shifted from criticizing abstract banking systems to outright anti-Semitism. Yeah, he started heavily implying and then openly stating that international Jewish bankers were the cause of the Depression. He was providing a simple, identifiable scapegoat for complex structural economic failures.
So Lewis is watching Huey Long promise the moon and Father Coughlin broadcast scapegoats into 30 million living rooms. But there's another layer here. Beyond the domestic demagogues, there was a darker shadow coming from his own home. Let's talk about Dorothy Thompson.
Yes. Dorothy Thompson was Lewis's second wife, and she is arguably the most important influence on this novel. She was an incredibly prominent journalist, and she's one of the first American correspondents to really sound the alarm about what was happening in Europe. She had actually interviewed Adolf Hitler in 1931 before he took full power.
What did she see that other people missed?
She saw the normalization of the abnormal. By 1934, she became the first American journalist to be expelled from Nazi Germany. She saw firsthand how a modern, highly educated, cultured nation could succumb to totalitarianism. She understood that fascism didn't present itself as a villainous conspiracy to the masses. It presented itself as national renewal, as a restoration of pride and order.
So Lewis is literally sitting at his breakfast table, hearing firsthand accounts of the Nazi propaganda machine, the suspension of civil liberties, the creation of concentration camps. It's not abstract news to him. It's his wife's daily reporting.
Yes, exactly. The biographer Mark Schorer went so far as to say that it can't happen. Here would never have been written if Lewis hadn't been married to Dorothy Thompson.
Wow.
She gave him the structural blueprint of how fascist dictatorships actually operate in practice, how they disguise vicious persecution behind a mask of patriotism. Lewis also spent time picking the brain of his neighbor, the investigative reporter George Seldes. Seldes had covered the rise of Mussolini in Italy, and Lewis pumped him for every mechanical detail he could remember about everyday life under fascism.
So with all that historical anxiety simmering, the Depression, Huey Long, Coughlin, Hitler, Mussolini, Lewis sits down in the summer of 1935 and writes this cautionary tale at a blistering pace. He brings all these elements together to explore the tension between democratic forms and authoritarian function. And that brings us to the architect of this normalization in the novel, the fictional demagogue Berzelius Windrip.
Buzz Windrip is a masterpiece of a character because he is so deeply familiar to the American psyche. He isn't a stiff, distant European-style dictator in a military uniform.
Right.
He's a folksy, backslapping, charismatic politician. He kisses babies, he tells folksy jokes, he rails against the coastal elites.
But he's not actually the mastermind, is he? I'm looking at the character of Lee Saracen, his secretary. Windrip is the face, but Saracen is the engine.
That is a crucial distinction. Windrip has the instinct for the crowd, but Saracen is the intellectual architect. Saracen is a cynical, highly educated ghostwriter who authors Windrip's populist manifesto, a book called 0 Hour.
Ah.
Saracen understands the mechanics of propaganda. He knows how to package tyranny as down-home common sense.
I want to dig into 0 Hour because the rhetoric Saracen uses is brilliant. He writes with these deliberate, folksy metaphors. There's a famous passage where he compares old-fashioned, complicated economics to holding up your pants with a high-toned, limey accent, talking about braces and trousers.
Right.
But Windrip's new economics are compared to the good old galluses on our breeches that kids wear in the cornfields.
It's brilliant manipulation. What Saracen is doing is short-circuiting critical thinking through cultural affinity.
I see it. He wraps a radical systemic upheaval in the comforting language of rural nostalgia. If I'm a farmer in 1936 who just lost his land, and some politician comes along speaking my exact dialect, mocking the fancy bankers in New York with their braces and trousers, I'm instantly disarmed.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at his tax policy. I'm looking at his vibe.
That's the cognitive bypass. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Lewis is illustrating here is the primary hidden system of the novel, which is democratic institutional capture through normalization. Windrip does not march on Washington with an invading army to destroy the system. Instead, he legally and methodically disables the checks on his power from within the system using the language of the system itself.
And here's where it gets wild. He tells everyone exactly how he's going to do it. He doesn't hide it. We have to look at Windrip's campaign platform, which he calls the 15 points of victory for the forgotten men.
Yeah.
I look at this list, and my modern brain just screams, how on earth does a population actively vote for their own subjugation? What is the psychological mechanism here?
To understand that, you have to trace the incentives. When a system is under extreme economic stress, voters prioritize immediate, tangible relief over abstract democratic principles.
Because the Constitution doesn't put food on the table.
Exactly. Let's break down the mechanics of the 15 points. Windrip promises immense tangible security. Point 14 promises that all bonuses for veterans will be immediately paid in cash. And for those earning less than $5,000 a year, the promised sums will be doubled.
Free money. He's just offering $5,000, which in the 1930s was a fortune.
He's buying a massive voting bloc. He promises to punish the greedy bankers. Point 1 says all finance will be under the absolute control of a government bank. He promises status to his followers. And crucially, he provides convenient scapegoats for all their suffering.
Let's talk about the scapegoats, point 9 and point 10.
Point 9 demands that international Jewish finance and Jewish communism be barred from all activity. Now, Saracen wraps this in a thin veneer of plausible deniability. The platform claims they have no quarrel with individual Jews and are proud to have rabbis among our directors.
Oh, wow.
But the systemic mechanism for persecution is put right there in print. It creates a legal framework to target anyone they label a Jewish financier. Point 10 ensures that well-paying jobs held by Negroes will be systematically given to his white supporters.
It's a coalition built on bribery, resentment, and targeted exclusion. He is weaponizing the worst impulses of a desperate society. But here's the part that I keep getting stuck on. Point 15. Because in point 15, he is putting the literal death of the Constitution in writing.
Yeah. Point 15 is the fatal flaw in the platform, the Trojan horse that the voters willingly pull inside the gates. It explicitly demands that Congress initiate constitutional amendments, granting the president the absolute authority to institute all necessary measures during this critical epoch.
Wow.
It reduces Congress to a purely advisory capacity, unable to act without the president's authorization, and it completely strips the Supreme Court of its power to rule any act of the president or his aides unconstitutional.
He's telling them, point blank, I'm going to become a dictator, I will ignore the courts, I will sideline Congress, and they vote for him anyway. I hear that and think I'd never fall for that. Nobody would vote for the end of checks and balances.
You'd think so.
But because it's wrapped up in the promise of a $5,000 allowance and the punishment of people they already resent, the voters just gloss over the fine print.
The characters in the novel actually discuss this very phenomenon. Doremus Jessup, the local newspaper editor, points out to his friends that Windrip never once mentions free speech or civil liberties in his articles of faith. The warning signs are flashing neon, but the citizens ignore it because the rhetoric is intoxicating.
Can we talk about that rhetoric? There's a scene in the book, a massive rally at Madison Square Garden.
Yes, and chillingly, that scene foreshadowed actual American fascist rallies that would happen at Madison Square Garden just a few years after the book was published. At this rally, Windrip declares that the League of Forgotten Men is sick unto death of being dispossessed, and that they demand control be unqualifiedly taken away from the private banks.
The phrase, League of Forgotten Men, is so potent. If you feel invisible, if the economy has crushed you and the elites are ignoring you, and suddenly a charismatic leader points right at you and says, "You are forgotten, but I see you, and I will punish the people who did this to you," that is a powerful drug.
It really is.
When you promise to restore dignity to people who feel humiliated, they are remarkably willing to surrender the mechanics of liberty.
Precisely because they feel the mechanics of liberty haven't worked for them anyway. If the free market resulted in them starving, why would they fight to protect the free market?
That makes a terrifying kind of sense. So Windrip wins the election. He becomes president. Now what? I want to understand the mechanics of the hollowing out. How does a democracy actually collapse once the demagogue is in the Oval Office?
It operates as a reinforcing feedback loop. It's a sequence of systemic dominoes. First, you have the economic insecurity, which increases the demand for a strong leader. The leader makes lavish promises and uses massive public spectacle to expand his support. This overwhelming support, combined with the promise of stability, leads to elite accommodation.
Okay, let me stop you there. Elite accommodation. I struggle to understand the bankers and the industrialists in this story. These are smart, ruthless people who understand power. Why on earth would they hand over their leverage to a populist who just wants to break the system?
Because of self-interest and a massive miscalculation of risk.
Okay.
It's the classic metaphor of riding the tiger. The establishment elites think they can use the tiger to hunt their enemies, completely ignoring the fact that once the tiger is done, it's going to eat them too.
Yeah.
The bankers and industrialists initially support Windrip because his system promises to bust the independent labor unions and lower their taxes. They see him as a useful, vulgar tool to discipline the workforce and crush left-wing organizing.
They think they can tame him.
Exactly. They believe they're the adults in the room. They don't realize until it's far too late that a system capable of stripping rights from workers can just as easily strip wealth from the elite. Once you dismantle the rule of law to punish your opponents, you have no shield when the dictator turns his sights on you.
Which brings us to how Windrip actually structures the economy once he's in power. He institutes the corporate state, or the corpo regime. My notes say Secretary Saracen lifts this idea directly from Mussolini's Italy. What is the corpo state, mechanically? How does a syndicate differ from a normal labor union?
In a traditional capitalist democracy, labor and management are independent entities that negotiate, often adversarially, through strikes and collective bargaining. The corpo system dissolves that independence. Windrip's government dissolves the American Federation of Labor, the Railway Brotherhoods, and the Federal Department of Labor. In their place, they create government-controlled syndicates.
So they divide society up.
Yes. They divide all occupations into 6 classes: agriculture, industry, commerce, transportation, banking, and a grab bag for arts and sciences. Parallel to the workers' syndicates are employers' confederations, and they all culminate in a national council of corporations.
But if it's all government-controlled, it means the right to strike is gone.
Completely gone. A strike becomes an act of treason against the state. The workers are told this system elevates them to partners in the nation, but functionally, they have been stripped of all bargaining power. And the elites love this initially, because it means no more labor disruptions.
Until they realize the government is dictating their production quotas and profit margins?
Right.
It's a trap for everyone. But how do they maintain the illusion of success? If you're fundamentally breaking the economy and paying for massive private armies, the budget must be a disaster.
The regime relies on massive creative accounting and propaganda. They boast about a 100% economy in military spending. How? By hiding the staggering cost of Windrip's new private army under the Department of Education budget.
That is insidious. You look at the budget, see huge funding for education, and think the government is building schools, when really they are buying rifles.
They also claim average wages are up by doing statistical tricks with categories of labor. They
Ah.
conveniently forget to count the millions of political dissidents, minorities, and unemployed people who have been forced into forced labor camps. If you remove the lowest earners from the statistical pool by putting them in camps, your average wage looks like it's booming.
But a system like this requires enforcement.
hmm
You can't just mandate syndicates and hide budgets without someone holding a gun.
And that brings us to the Minutemen. This is perhaps the most chilling part of the transition. It feels like the boiling frog metaphor.
The Minutemen, or MMs, are the perfect example of how rhetoric metastasizes into institutional behavior. They start out during the campaign as just these swaggering marching clubs, a nationwide league organized by Windrip's crony, Colonel Dewey Hake. They seem almost goofy at first. They march in parades, they wear these imitation cavalry uniforms from 1870, blue tunics, yellow stripes, sleek black boots. They look like a slightly aggressive fraternity or a historical reenactment society.
But that is the boil starting to simmer. On Windrip's third day in office, his third act as commander-in-chief is to recognize the Minutemen as an unpaid but official auxiliary of the regular army.
Wow.
He orders government arsenals to instantly issue them rifles, bayonets, automatic pistols, and machine guns.
So in a single afternoon, a partisan marching club becomes a heavily armed state police force answerable only to the president.
Yes, and they are immediately put to use. Because here is where the institutional resistance actually tries to kick in. When Windrip sends his message to Congress demanding the passage of Point 15, the bill giving him complete dictatorial control, Congress actually finds its spine. By joint resolution, both houses reject the demand.
Wait, really? I always assumed the institutions just rolled over and rubber-stamped it.
Yeah. They try to resist. But constitutional resistance is absolutely meaningless if the executive controls an armed faction that operates outside the law. When Congress rejects the bill, Windrip simply proclaims a state of martial law. The Minutemen are dispatched to arrest more than 100 congressmen who oppose the bill.
I am fascinated by the language used to justify this. How does an American administration justify arresting elected representatives to the public? They can't just say we are crushing the opposition.
They use the brilliant, perverse language of authoritarian bureaucracy. Lee Saracen explains to the press that the congressmen aren't being arrested for political opposition. No, they are simply being safeguarded because they were threatened by irresponsible and seditious elements.
Protective arrest.
Exactly. It sounds bureaucratic, it sounds safe, it sounds like the government is doing them a favor by locking them in a cell.
But if this is happening, if Congress is in jail and partisan militias are roaming the streets with machine guns and historical cosplay, why doesn't the public revolt? Surely that is the moment the spell breaks.
Some do. There are riots in Washington. A mob surrounds the jail where the congressmen are held. But this is where Windrip's absolute mastery of civic legitimacy comes into play. He addresses the Minutemen over the radio. He calls them his boys. He tells them that the people protesting are the elites who scorned them, who wouldn't give them jobs, who called them bums.
He weaponizes their class resentment and gives it a badge.
He tells the Minutemen that they are now the highest lords of the land, the aristocracy. He gives them moral permission to use extreme violence under the guise of restoring order to a proud, rich land. To a young, unemployed man who felt like a failure yesterday, Windrip is offering purpose, status, and power.
And it's also about the aesthetics, isn't it? He keeps the familiar symbols to soothe the public.
This is vital to understanding institutional capture. Windrip doesn't move into a military fortress. He keeps the White House. He doesn't invent a new flag with a swastika or a hammer and sickle. He wraps himself in the stars and stripes.
Right.
He doesn't call his enforcers the Gestapo or the KGB. He calls them Minutemen, deliberately evoking the heroes of the American Revolutionary War.
So to the average, uninformed citizen, it still looks like America. The names are the same, the buildings are the same, the patriotic songs are the same. You still go to the Rotary Club on Tuesday. The underlying function has become a totalitarian dictatorship, but the democratic forms have been perfectly preserved as a hollow shell.
And that is how silence becomes consent. The coercion raises the cost of dissent so high that people stay quiet, and the regime points to that quiet and says, look, the people approve.
Which brings us to the human scale of this investigation. We've talked about the macro politics of Washington, but what does this systemic erosion actually look like for the average person? To really grasp this, we have to shift our lens to the novel's protagonist, Doremus Jessup.
Doremus Jessup is the emotional and moral center of the book. He is a 60-year-old newspaper editor in the small town of Fort Beulah, Vermont. He publishes the Daily Informer. Lewis describes him as a mild, rather indolent, and somewhat sentimental liberal.
He's that respectable bystander we all know. I love the description of him as a 19th century individualist at heart. He sports a beard that people think makes him look artistic. He reads Time, The New Republic, The Nation. He hates absolutism in any form, whether it's communism, fascism, or religious fundamentalism.
Yeah.
He just wants to be left alone to enjoy his small-town life, go on country picnics with his family, read his books, and avoid anything neurotic or modern.
And that is precisely why he is the ultimate target of Lewis's satire. Doremus represents the complacent, educated, middle-class citizen. At the beginning of the crisis, when people are debating Windrip's rise at the local drugstore, Doremus and his peers share this fatal assumption. They tell each other things like that couldn't ever happen here in New England.
He thinks his geography saves him. He relies on the mythology of American exceptionalism. He thinks it's a phase. He writes these mildly critical editorials in his paper, assuming the hysteria will just blow over. He counsels patience and moderation while the house is actively burning down.
But what Lewis is arguing is that Doremus's respectable passivity is not a defense against authoritarianism. It is the very environment that allows it to advance. As the corpo state tightens its grip, Doremus has a chilling realization. He realizes that the tyranny isn't primarily the fault of big business or even the demagogues doing the dirty work.
It's the fault of the bystanders.
He realizes it is the fault of the lazy-minded Doremus Jessups who have let the demagogues wriggle in without fierce enough protest.
The cost of that passivity is devastatingly high. Because the regime doesn't stay in Washington. It comes to Fort Beulah. It becomes incredibly intimate, and it comes in the form of people Doremus knows. I want to talk about Shad Ledoux.
Shad Ledoux is how systemic collapse becomes personal. Shad Ledoux was Doremus's hired hand. He chopped wood, did chores around the property. He was a resentful, surly guy who felt the world owed him more.
And under the Corpo regime, that resentment is weaponized. Ledoux becomes the local county commissioner and an MM battalion leader. Suddenly, the guy who used to take orders from Doremus has a uniform, a gun, and absolute, unquestioned authority over his former boss.
And Ledoux uses that authority for petty, brutal revenge. The regime institutes a policy of book burning, an idea spearheaded by the Secretary of Culture to safeguard the state from subversive ideas. But it's carried out locally by men like Ledoux. Ledoux and his thugs come to Doremus's house.
This scene is so visceral. Doremus had tried to be smart. He saw the crackdowns coming, so he took his radical books, Das Kapital, Thorstein Veblen, old files of liberal magazines, even his copies of Henry David Thoreau, and hid them inside an old horsehair sofa.
Right.
But Ledoux forces his way in. He rips the house apart. He makes Doremus watch as they burn his books, including his most treasured possession, a 34-volume extra illustrated edition of Charles Dickens.
It is the ultimate violation of the 19th century liberal mind, the physical destruction of the free, inquiring intellect. It's the moment Doremus realizes that moderation is useless against a force that wants to destroy your reality.
Wow.
And the tragedy only compounds from there. The violence escalates. Doremus's son-in-law is executed by the regime. The brutal violence that Doremus thought was confined to European newsreels or distant cities is suddenly happening right on his own front porch.
So how does this mild, bearded newspaper editor who hates collective action react to his family being murdered and his life destroyed?
He is forced into a profound transformation. He moves from being a skeptical observer to an active, radical dissident. When his own son tries to justify the regime's brutality with the old totalitarian cliche that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, Doremus throws him out of the house.
Yeah.
He finally takes a stand. He realizes the legal avenues are gone, so he starts publishing an underground seditious paper called Vermont Vigilance, exposing the corruption, the graft, and the murders of the corporate state.
It turns into a family resistance cell. His widowed daughter sneaks these seditious pamphlets into copies of Reader's Digest at the local drugstore. They are fighting a guerrilla information war, but they get caught. On July 4, 1938, and Lewis lays the irony on thick there, arresting a patriot on Independence Day, the Minutemen wreck his house and drag Doremus away to a concentration camp,
where he is systematically tortured and nearly beaten to death. The man who just wanted to read Thoreau and mind his own business is plunged into the absolute darkest depths of systemic violence.
I find it fascinating how the camp changes him.
He experiences the desperate camaraderie of the prisoners. For the first time in his life, he actually understands what drives oppressed men to violence. He survives the camp, he manages to escape to Canada, and he becomes a secret agent for a new underground resistance network, sneaking back into the U.S. to coordinate raids against Minutemen posts.
But even as a resistance fighter, he stays true to his core identity. This is what I love about the character arc. He doesn't become a communist or a fascist to fight the corpos. He tells himself that what he wants is mass action by just one member, alone on a hilltop. He's conducting a one-man revolution for the preservation of the individual mind.
Which is Lewis's ultimate point about the American character. Doremus learns the hardest way possible that you cannot simply mind your own business when the system itself is structurally eroding. The preservation of the free, inquiring, critical spirit requires active, sometimes dangerous defense. Passivity in the face of structural capture is complicity.
Okay, let's take a step back from Sinclair Lewis, Buzz Windrip in the 1930s. If we strip away the specific historical details of the novel and look at the underlying mechanics, what is the crisis in perception here?
The fundamental crisis in perception is treating freedom as a permanent, inherent national trait rather than recognizing it for what it actually is, a fragile system.
Right.
We misperceive democracy as a monument made of stone, when in reality, it is a delicate engine that requires constant maintenance. It is sustained entirely by active institutions, robust civic norms, vocal dissent, and strict enforceable limits on concentrated power.
We fall into the Doreenus Jessup trap. We think it can't happen here because we are American or British or French. We rely on our geography or our national mythology to save us.
But systems do not care about your national mythology. If you change the incentives, if you remove the checks and balances, the system will change its output. The perception gap is failing to see that authoritarianism doesn't have to announce itself with a new flag and a foreign accent. It can emerge through the very institutions designed to prevent it, preserving familiar names and public justifications while their underlying functions change completely.
A local marching club becomes a paramilitary force. A Department of Education becomes a slush fund for a private army. A democratically elected president uses the law to make himself a king. And all the while, the citizens are told, and many genuinely believe, that this is all being done to protect the homeland.
Which is why systems thinking is so critical. You have to look past the rhetoric and the bunting and look at the mechanics of power. Where is the power concentrating? Who is being silenced? What institutional checks are being legally bypassed?
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. If democratic breakdown can look completely ordinary while it's happening, wrapped in bunting and familiar slogans, with the Rotary Club still meeting on Tuesdays and the local paper still being delivered, what signals distinguish normal political conflict from actual structural erosion? When does a political compromise cross the line into institutional surrender?
Yeah.
Crisis in perception is not about telling people what to think. It is about making the systems shaping perception more visible. Because when structural forces remain hidden, meaningful change becomes far more difficult to imagine. Every book is more than a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can examine the systems shaping our world. Whether today's investigation challenged what you thought you knew or simply encouraged you to ask better questions, the goal remains the same: to think critically, follow the evidence, and remain open to changing your mind when the facts lead somewhere unexpected.
Well said.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
Absolutely.
Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and learn to spot the crisis in perception.
Yes.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
Thanks, everyone.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
It's great.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, share, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.